Alright, we're doing another tomato review for you today, and today's tomato review is going to be on the Florida Petite Micro Dwarf tomato. And I've been growing this tomato plant now again for probably a year plus, a little over a year now, maybe a year and a month or so. And it is considered a determinate tomato, so you're probably asking, well, if it's a determinate tomato, how could you be growing it for a year? That's because I manipulate the plant to keep growing rather than dying. So it's very similar to the way you would manipulate beans to keep producing beans. So if you have bean plants growing and you grow beans, you need to pick those pods off as fast as possible. You don't want to leave pods on your bean plants to ripen on the plants. If you're doing that, then it'll produce the beans, you'll get dry bean from it, but then the plant dies. In order to keep that plant constantly producing more and more and more and more beans, you have to keep picking the beans. That's just the way it is. Determinate tomatoes are kind of the same way. Not exactly the same way, but kind of the same way. So as long as if you keep picking off all those tomatoes and you're pruning the plant, you have to also prune the plant at the same time. You're picking the tomatoes and you're pruning the plant, it'll constantly grow and put out new branches with new fruit on it. And each one of those branches that it puts fruit on, those are what are going to end up dying back. So what it'll do is you'll prune it, put out new branches, they'll put out tomatoes, then those branches will start to yellow and die back. Then you're going to want to prune those branches, and they'll put out new branches, and it's just the same cycle over and over. So as long as if you keep doing that, it'll stay alive. So this is a micro dwarf tomato. It is the Florida Petite, and I gotten whacked a few times by the birds. You could see a few of them were pecked. I don't know if you can see that or not. They were pecked by the birds, blasting holes in my tomatoes like crazy this year. I probably lost about maybe 10 to 20% of the tomatoes that have been coming out and ripening. They're all blasted or ripped off, or the smaller tomatoes, they just grab them and fly away with them. So I'm really getting beaten up by the birds today. So we're going to have to take care of the birds. And I do have bird repellent for that. But in the meanwhile, this tomato is a wonderful tomato. I've been eating tomatoes off this plant basically since I've grown it. So when you start this plant, it'll produce tomatoes within the first, say, 2 months, maybe 2.5 months. You'll start getting your tomatoes then. Then those branches are going to start to die. You're going to want to get all the tomatoes off there, whether they're green or red, and you're going to want to prune that plant where you see, the new sprouts coming up. You want to prune off all the old stuff, let them new sprouts, those new suckers come up and develop, and they'll put out another bunch of tomatoes, and it just keeps going and going and going. And I've been getting and eating tomatoes off of it on a regular basis now. However, it's not a heavy producing tomato plant. It does produce a good amount. It's just you're not going to get like a cherry tomato where it's putting out hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of tomatoes. It ain't like that. It's a very small plant. And this is one plant that put this many tomatoes out in a month or two. So, I mean, you can see that's a pretty good amount of tomatoes for such a tiny little plant, guys. If this plant was 10 feet tall, it'd be like maybe 1,000 tomatoes coming off the thing. But for such a tiny little plant, this is a great amount of tomatoes. So what can you use it for? It's basically good salad tomato. It's definitely good for, you could use it really if you want to slice it and put it on hamburgers. I like to slice it very thin and then put it on sandwiches that way, because these aren't actually small tomatoes. Here, I'll show you a few. Some of these tomatoes I've had gotten maybe even a little bigger than this. That's a nice tomato, guys. They do crack, by the way. If you overwater or it gets stuck in the rain, they will crack. But I mean, look at that. That's a nice tomato. And then there's small ones, There's the little ones, like cherry size like that. And they're kind of flattened a little. You can see how they're not perfectly round. They're kind of flattened. Hopefully my camera's coming in clear. I can't tell. So you can see they're a little flattened. And oftentimes the shoulders are like a yellow or with a green in it, oftentimes. But there'll be something on the top. They're never totally, truly 100% red. They always got some kind of shouldering on the top. I'll show you the inside of the tomato. Give you an idea what that looks like. Okay, that's the inside. It's a beautiful little tomato. And let's do a bricks on it. And see where our numbers are at on the bricks. The numbers been all over this year so far with tomatoes. They've been up and down. So I can't even predict what I think it would be. This one's 4. It's going to be low on the sweetness, but that's all right. These tomatoes too have been sitting on this table too for about a week now. So that sometimes interferes with the flavor, because now it's starting to get real juicy and it's getting ready to turn into mush. So let's give this one a go. Well, what I'll say is it's nice and tangy, and it's got a real nice tomato flavor to it, but it's low on the sugar. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to taste good. I like the taste of this tomato simply because of the flavor of the tomato on the back of your tongue. It has a nice delivery of tomato tanginess. It just lights up your whole palate. It just ignites your whole palate. Really brings makes you kind of get salivating, because it's got that tanginess to it, but it also has a little bit of a tardiness to it, which really puckers up the back of your tongue area, and that really gets your juices going, and that's what you want to do when you're looking to really stimulate your appetite. And this tomato is definitely a tomato you're not just going to eat one of. At first, when you eat it, it's like, ooh, that's tangy. But then the flavor comes out, and it's just like, wow, what a flavor. It works so well with that tanginess. So it's definitely worth it. Yes, I will say that sweetness was a little low. But guys, not every single tomato you eat has to be a sugar ball. You know, that's a lot of people misunderstand tomatoes. They think, oh, they're low sweetness, they're no good tomatoes. Some tomatoes are meant to not be so sweet. You don't necessarily want really sweet tomatoes, especially sauce tomatoes. You don't really want too much sugar in that. If you're if you're like me and I don't like too much sugar in my tomatoes, I like more of a tangy effect when I'm making sauce with them rather than sweetness. So I don't necessarily care for the sugars. That's why a lot of tomatoes are kind of harvested when they're in their orange stage when you're making sauce. So all that starches didn't convert over to sugar yet. And so when you get your sauce, you're going to get a nice, rich tomato flavor with not too much sugar in it. Whereas if you make it with really sweet sauce, yeah, it's good, but it depends. It really depends on what the flavor you're trying to get out of what you're making. I don't always like to make my tomato sauces sugary sweet, for example. I do like a tarty type flavor. This is that type of flavor that would make for a good sauce. Now, can you get enough tomatoes to make a large pot of sauce out of that? Not necessarily, but you know, twice this amount here, and you got a big enough amount of sauce where you can mix it to, say, a half a pound of pasta and eat really well, and eat very good, actually. And when the tomatoes are like this, what I would suggest is you don't necessarily cook them down. You put them in a blender, you break them up, and then you blanch it while it's blended up. You blanch it a little bit. You don't want to blend it so you're grinding up the seeds. You just want to tap it, guys. You put it in the blender, you tap until it breaks up the skin, and you don't want to grind it until it's smooth like puree. You want to leave it kind of chunky. Then you put it in your pot like that, and you let it cook for like 5 minutes. You don't overcook it. You can overcook your sauce. Yes, you can. And when you do that, it gets too bitter. It starts to taste raw. It burns your throat. You don't want that. You want sauce to be smooth. And so you just want to blanch a little bit, and you want to cook the other ingredients that are in your sauce, your peppers, and then maybe your garlic and your fresh onions. You want them to cook a little bit down. Don't worry about cooking the sauce. This is gonna work perfectly fine, and that'll make a fantastic sauce. If you cook it down, yeah, there's not enough tomatoes here. You're cooking all the water out of it. You don't want to do that. You want to cook it just a little bit and eat it that way. Believe me when I tell you, I've been eating tomatoes my whole life. I know how to eat tomatoes. So yeah, it's a great tomato. Definitely, again, it's a micro dwarf, so definitely give this one a go if you're somebody who lives in an apartment or a condominium and you don't have a lot of area to grow tomatoes. Guys, this is it right here. Dwarf variety tomatoes, micro dwarf variety tomatoes are the way to go. In fact, there are dwarf tomatoes that are almost micro dwarf. They're like in between. Like Tiny Tims are like almost micro dwarf. They're really a small tomato plant, but they're not considered micro dwarf. But they're also a good choice for indoors because the Tiny Tim is a very heavy producing tomato variety, very very heavy, for such a small plant. But this tomatoes, I mean, for a plant that didn't get too much bigger than, I don't think, 6 inches, put out this amount of tomatoes every 2 to 3 months, you know, and even more than that because I have been picking these tomatoes, guys. I am eating them here and there. It's very hard for me to walk by a tomato plant and not pick one, you know. So I've been eating them. So if you were to really look at what we would have gotten in the full, you could almost figure about double what you see here is what you would get off that plant. If you can keep yourself from eating those tomatoes, you get about double of what you see there every 2 months to 2.5 months or something like that. And you'll get it easy if you put it out in the sun. You'll get that kind of, you know, harvest easy. And then you can prune it down and do all your stuff and get another harvest. Great variety, guys. I definitely highly recommend the Florida Petite. I'm a big fan of it now. And I will offer seeds at the end of the year on hrseeds.com. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you on the next one. Take care.